should I start? First of all, I'm humbled to be in this company. I think there's a lot of experiences in this room that's more capable of saying something about this work than I am, I think. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. So there's a couple of takeaways, well, many takeaways from the event in New York. And maybe I should just mention three. I think one of the cross-cutting issues was around the difference between design as a method or as a project and then design as a craft. And by that I mean the challenge of embedding, the challenge of implementing or taking on a mindset and a value set, embodying a certain approach. And I think some of the examples we heard, it was a beautiful example, but when we talk about impact and we talk about impacting organizations, a lot of the conversations I've been having with governments over the years has been around what actually it's about a mindset or a new habit or a new way of thinking. And if that's the impact that we are supposed to have as well, there's a big measurement problem there. And one of the things we're actually working on at Nesta in the project I'm running currently is actually trying to co-create with the community of practice what a impact framework might look like for cultural change. We're actually looking at the behaviors we'd like to see rather than the uptake of a method. So I'll be keen to talk about that, but I think that was that came out in a number of conversations at the event. Then a second thing for me personally was, given that I'm from Denmark and I work in the UK and it was an American setting, was a question around who owns the impact, or in other words, who are you accountable to? So I'm used to being held accountable to the government because the government owns everything in Scandinavia. It's a different model here and it's a very different model in the US. It was interesting to see how the philanthropies, for example, that there were a lot of people being funded by those kinds of funding, how they talk very differently about that relationship. So I'm curious about sort of the impact relationships when we are measuring. Who are we held accountable to, and what does that do to the practice, and how can we be smarter about building coalitions around impact with the right sets of accountabilities. And then the final thing, maybe just to mention, was around, somebody mentioned, it was in the video, somebody mentioned scaling as something we still struggle with. And I think there was an inherent discussion about scaling when we talk about impact. You mentioned it before, Cheryl. If we think that solutions come from inside communities and that should be the model that we're supporting, it's also a different model of scaling if we want large-scale impact. So one of the things we've been working at when I was at MindLab was to try to reframe what a reform would be if we take that seriously. And this was something around working with the broader design principles and allowing for a bottom-up sort of sense-making process in different local contexts. And we didn't get very far. We had a progressive minister, but as soon as she was gone, then that project disappeared as well. But I think there's something there around that this conversation actually has a huge implication of how we think about scaling and spreading solutions and sharing experiences. And I think we have to come up with a better language around what is the model and how is that operationalized.
That was one of the fascinating things for me about the day was the multiple models. No one having the right answer. Everybody piloting, trialing, learning by doing. I mean, one of my favourite pieces was on the film as well, which was Roseanne Hegarty's piece, which was, she took the opposite to what most people would measure. And she was saying, how do all of the organisations that she'd gathered from LA get in the way of people being housed? And she you know, so often there's a multiple of approaches, but the fact that she made that approach with this group of organisations made them have complete breakthroughs in terms of what they were doing, and then therefore how they could measure the impact to individuals' lives, and then really be able to scale it. I mean, she went to some crazy numbers, didn't she, in the end, using a neighbourhood-based approach. So she's scaling the model in neighbourhoods, and it was something like, I'm just going to see if I wrote it down. Her target was 100,000 homes for homeless people, but they well surpassed that figure. So I think for me, the flavour of both that event and I hope today is that we're all exploring this stuff. And part of the provocation to you to ask you for questions is also for you to be stuck in it rather than observing it.
I think the biggest revelation for me, and it relates to a lot of the questions, is that the principles of social design are common, but the applications are so vastly different, and each one of them has to be measured in a different way. So Michael Murphy, who's creating built environments, measures the environmental footprint. He measures, in one case, he did a facility for pregnant women, right? They actually measured how many more healthy births there were. But he also measures how many jobs he creates in a community. He measures the level of education. He measures other kinds of community dimensions. That's hugely different. What Evan Thomas does is he develops ways to measure how products are being used in the field. So it talks a lot about water pumps, right? So where typically people might measure how many gallons the water pumps or how well it works, right? He's testing how people use it and how the way they really use it compared to how they say they use it when nobody's, or when people are watching and when they're not. And that's very different from service design. So what Anne LaFond is measuring, and she's really interesting, she and I worked on the same Gates Foundation grant that was an experiment to see whether we could help innovations emerge from the communities most affected by serious issues around maternal and infant health. And Anne talks about, she's looking at how the design process changes the behavior of the people doing it, and what does that do to a team, and how does that make human capacity for creativity more. And so depending on what you're doing, it's really important. And Jake Porway, the data scientist, this makes him crazy, because he'll say, you have to figure out what you're measuring. Don't even begin, right? And people say, yeah, I want to know the impact of social design. Well, there isn't one, and there isn't one way to measure it. But that was it was just, you saw all these people together talking, and I said, well, of course. But I hadn't thought that before.
I wasn't there.
But if you were.
But I pretend that I was. No, the only thing that I would add to the conversation is that in terms of the design emerging from the problem set, or where the problems occur, is, and it solves the measurement problem as well, is Jerry Sternin, who was really the founder, he and his wife, of something called positive deviance, is a change model that basically says that within any problem set is the solution. And when he started to do his work, his first big work was on eradicating malnutrition in Southeast Asia. And for years, people had tried to measure it. UNICEF, Save the Children. He and his wife went in, and what they did is they looked at the positive deviance, those people who did not exhibit the problem that 90% of the population had. And what he found out is, by just going into the community to find the positive deviance, the 10% that weren't malnourished, he actually learned what they did. And he basically said that what you do is you help people act their way into a new way of thinking, not think their way into a new way of acting. So he would find people who had very different strategies, although everybody's still having pretty much access to the same resources. And it was phenomenal. What he really found out was some very simple solutions that everybody could do, which was, and he didn't actually need to measure it at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, malnutrition actually went away. And it went away when people used strategies like being able to lick their hands when they're in the rice field, to get microscopic crabs, which are great sources of protein, or not just eating one little bowl of rice in the morning, but keeping it going through the day. Every one of the strategies came from the people who actually were healthy. And all they did was to change, to help people behave that way, not think differently, behave that way. So I say this, it's a long way of saying that sometimes we also, measurement is expensive and measurement is overrated to a certain degree, because if you build into what you're doing behaviors that change, that becomes your measurement in a certain way. So I just thought I'd add that. Not that I was at this great event.
No, but she doesn't need to be, because she, you know, what we talked about, how we can continue to include you in the conversation. If you will all give us your emails, we can also start posting some of these things. Jerry Sternin has written some remarkable papers on what he did, you know, and there are people, Jerry is one of them, Paul Polak is another one. He's 83 now, and he would never have thought to call himself a designer or a human-centered anything. But you know, there are cases of just remarkable success stories that if you don't know them, I'm happy to collect them and put them online if you want to read them. The other thing is, Anne LaFond has just written, from JSI, so they're the M&E company, she's just written a research report on this big project for the Gates Foundation that I'm sure she would be happy to publish.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Getting access to a common set reference point, I think, is really, really helpful. So we're not reinventing wheels.
We are not.
Because often that could be, you know, people can be skidding around trying to resolve that stuff when it's already there.
Yeah.
So